Hello again. Now, the two-day U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit set to kick off tomorrow in Washington. It will be used as an opportunity for the United States to deepen ties across the African continent. It will build on shared values that foster economic agreement, strengthen health security, responding to the climate crisis and more. Well, let's talk about the significance of this and what we should expect the summit will achieve with our correspondent in New York this afternoon, William Denselow. William, good afternoon. Welcome. It looks like the U.S. is wasting no time to be able to regain whatever lost ground it has in competing with the likes of China, for example, for the African continent's relationships.
No, absolutely. This is just a couple of summits that we've seen since 2014, when then President Barack Obama first held this African Leaders Summit. What we're expecting in the nation's capital over the next couple of days is about 50 heads of state and senior government officials from across the African continent to come and meet directly with US lawmakers to try and deepen those ties that you rightly mentioned. Now, as far as many of those African leaders are concerned, well, there are a couple of things that desperately they want to see addressed. Of course, the Revitalising African Growth Opportunities Act, that is set to expire in 2025. All parties will be looking for further signs on how to expand that act and how to extend it going forward, even beyond 2025, what that means for helping to promote African businesses and seeing US trade come into the African continent as well. What can be done to ease some of those free trade barriers going forward to promote a win-win cooperation. Now, of course, you mentioned the competition the United States faces when it comes to wooing partners on the African continent. Of course, when it comes to China's trade with African partners, that was up at $261 billion last year. In comparison, US trade was just $64 billion. Now, when it comes to big splashy headlines we might expect out of this summit, well, in the past we've seen George W. Bush put lots of investment into an HIV/AIDS initiative. Then President Obama put plenty into powering Africa in his initiative. We've heard from Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary. She says don't expect any headline announcement when it comes to a big pan-African announcement. However, she says the whole key for the Biden administration is to promote individual partnerships across the continent.
Yeah, but you've mentioned the AGOA, that Growth Opportunity Act that you said is expiring next year. And it's not all African countries are benefiting from it. And we are hearing reports here in South Africa that South Africa might lose its standing in terms of the position in that kind of the preferential standing in terms of that act. Should we anticipate that from what you've been told, that the AGOA thing will be sort of upweighted compared to the past?
Yeah, it's certainly a concern. Of course, we know that Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, had a conversation with Minister Pandor just a couple of days ahead of this summit. So relations with South Africa are very much prominent in the minds of Washington. Of course, let's not forget that President Ramaphosa was in the nation's capital here in the United States in September, just before the United Nations General Assembly. So trade and wider ties between the two nations are expected to be absolutely crucial. We understand that providing more access when it comes to Africa's digital economy will be a key part of discussions, not just for South Africa and business leaders, but really for leaders across the African continent. We also can expect the United States to formally promote the African Union having a seat at the G20 as well. Of course, other nations have made that pledge too in recent weeks. We can also expect more to be done when it comes to a commitment to having African voices in prominent global institutions like the International Monetary Fund. So those are a few things that are set to be discussed and potentially will be announced over the next couple of days. And you mentioned those trade barriers. Of course, there are real concerns that things like trade practices, standards for goods have been barriers for many African firms doing business here in the United States. So we can expect that to be a key topic of conversation. And as far as the US is concerned, there is so much competition. It's not just China. There's the likes of the UAE, Turkey also making big plays to be bigger partners on the African continent. So certainly the Biden administration will have to do a great amount of wooing as well.
Yeah. Finally, William, will the Russia-Ukraine conflict feature at all? I'm asking this against the background that Russia has strengthened ties with many African countries, and countries like South Africa have taken a more of a neutral stance and saying, no, we need dialogue to end the conflict in Ukraine, while the United States might have been expecting a much stronger position. Should we expect that to feature? What are you hearing?
Certainly. This will be, of course, another key and prominent topic of conversations. Russia has really tried to position itself as a growing military partner, especially across the African continent. This will be something that the United States will want to discuss with leaders when they come to Washington. And yes, the ramifications of the war in Ukraine, of course, hitting so prominently across Africa as well. We've seen food insecurity become a pressing issue globally, perhaps felt most prominently in the Horn of Africa as well, considering the droughts that we've seen in that region too. So we can expect conversations on what more the United States can be done when it comes to the war in Ukraine and how to offset food insecurity. And really, of course, as far as the United States is also concerned, you rightly mentioned South Africa's stance when it comes to Ukraine. Two leaders, President Biden and Ramaphosa, discussed the war in Ukraine a little earlier in this year. The US has been really looking for African partners to stand more in lockstep with the United States with their condemnation of Russia, and that really hasn't come to fruition. So this will certainly be another opportunity for Washington to try and convince African leaders to stand against Russia. But of course, we have seen these deepening ties between many African nations and Moscow over recent months, so that certainly won't be a slam dunk.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting one. We do understand the focus is going to be on trade, investment or economic ties. Thank you very much, William Denselow, live to us from New York, our correspondent there, just setting the scene ahead of this 3-day summit, Africa-US summit, that's set to take place starting from tomorrow in Washington.